The flashbulbs in the Oregon State Convention Center were blinding, but the coldness in my chest was far sharper than any light. I'm Evelyn Vance. For over 40 years, my hands have been stained with motor oil and the honest dirt of a machine shop floor. Tonight at 64, the state of Oregon decided to honor those calloused hands with a Lifetime Achievement Award in mechanical engineering. The auditorium in Portland was packed. Hundreds of faces blurred under the bright lights, local leaders, young engineers I had mentored, and journalists holding cameras, ready to capture a moment of triumph. But as I sat on the elevated front row, my eyes kept drifting to the empty velvet chair right beside mine. That seat was reserved for my only son, Julian. Julian is 34 now. He lives in Seattle working as a digital marketing director, a world away from grease and iron. When he was 6, Julian used to sit right on that old wooden workbench in my shop, swinging his legs happily while I rebuilt carburetors. We had spoken just the week before. He promised he would fly down. He promised he would sit in that exact chair, shake my hand on stage, and let the state see the pride of a son. But yesterday afternoon, the text came in. Not from him, but from his feed. Julian canceled. Why? Because his wife, Chloe, had booked a last-minute luxury getaway to Maui. Chloe is a 28-year-old social media strategist who treats life like a photo op. To Chloe, a dusty mechanic from a small Oregon town didn't fit the aesthetic of a tropical beach resort. And Julian, caught tightly in her orbit, chose the pristine sands of Hawaii over a mother who was running out of breath. My fingers trembled slightly as I smoothed down my old wool blazer. It was the same blazer I wore to my husband's funeral 5 years ago. I took a shallow breath, feeling the familiar, quiet pinch of the chronic lung condition slowing me down. Then, a quiet presence stepped up from behind the heavy velvet curtain of the backstage wings. It was Marcus Hayes. Marcus had worked beside me for 8 years. He was in my blood. He lost both his parents in a highway accident when he was 19, wandering into my shop looking for odd jobs and a place to steady his life. But he'd never once left me alone. Over the past 8 years, Marcus became the shadow that kept the lights on, staying late to sweep the floors when my lungs grew too heavy for the work. Without a word, Marcus slid a small paper cup of water into my palm. He didn't offer empty pity. He just gave my shoulder a firm, grounding squeeze, whispered, "I'm right here, Evelyn," and stepped back into the shadows. I looked down at the empty seat beside me. A photographer from the local Gazette lifted his long lens camera and snapped a sharp, unsparing photograph of me, sitting alone next to a vacant velvet chair. That single photograph was uploaded to the local newswire before I even finished my acceptance speech. And within hours, the internet did what it does best. By midnight, the image of the empty seat had gone viral. Comments flooded in by the thousands. Strangers from across the country began tearing Julian and Chloe apart, dissecting every smiling, filtered vacation post on Chloe's profile, and contrasting it with the solitary mother sitting under the state lights. What kind of son chooses a beach vacation over his mother's lifetime achievement? One viral comment read, racking up 50,000 likes. Another wrote, "That young man sitting in the shadows is more of a son than the biological one ever was." Reading those comments on my phone later that night, I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt a deep, hollow ache because I knew deep down that the internet only saw the surface. They saw the villain and the victim. But as a mother, I knew the truest tragedy wasn't that my son missed a ceremony. The tragedy was that Julian had traded the rich, heavy substance of real life for a cheap digital illusion. And in doing so, he had locked himself out of his own history. Before we move on to what happened when that digital storm finally reached our doorstep, let me ask you this. My friends, as you listen to this story today, where are you tuning in from? Drop your city and state in the comments below and tell me, have you ever watched someone you love choose an illusion over the people who truly mattered? 3 days after the lights of the convention center faded, my lungs finally surrendered. It wasn't a sudden tragedy. It was the quiet, inevitable end of a chronic respiratory illness that had been stealing my breath for years. I passed away in my own bed, surrounded not by luxury, but by the smell of machine oil and the soft hum of the lathe downstairs. The real storm, however, didn't break until 3 days later, inside the wood-paneled office of Arthur Pendleton, the family attorney who had handled my papers for 30 years. Arthur sat behind his heavy oak desk, adjusting his glasses as he opened a thick manila folder. Across from him sat my son, Julian, looking sharp in an expensive designer suit he must have flown back from Seattle to wear. Right beside him was his wife, Chloe, tapping her polished acrylic nails impatiently, her phone glowing with notifications from online followers. And sitting quietly in the corner, wearing a simple, clean flannel shirt, was Marcus Hayes, the young man who had spent the last 8 years sweeping my floors and keeping me company when the house grew too quiet. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound dry and heavy in the small room. Before Evelyn passed, Arthur began, his voice steady. She updated her final will and testament. I am here today to read its binding terms regarding her estate, including the workshop and all liquid assets. If I know my son, Julian assumed this was just a formal formality, a standard handover of a lifelong legacy to the biological son who had made it in the big city. Looking back now, I need to make something clear. I changed my will 6 months before the end. Not because I stopped loving Julian, but because I realized love and responsibility aren't always the same thing. Arthur turned the page. To my son, Julian Vance, I leave my father's pocket watch and my forgiveness. To my trusted apprentice of 8 years, Marcus Hayes, I leave the entirety of my estate, including the commercial property, the machinery, and the total cash reserve held in the business trust, valued at exactly $1 million. The silence in the room didn't just drop, it shattered. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the color drained completely from Julian's face. His mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. He looked at Arthur, then at Marcus, and finally back at the legal document as if it were written in a foreign language. And then the quiet broke into a violent explosion. Julian surged out of his chair, slamming both hands down onto the desk. "Are you out of your mind?" Julian roared, his voice cracking with disbelief. $1 million. To an outsider, to a hired hand who just sweeps the floor. I am her only son. This is fraud. Before Arthur could answer, Chloe jumped to her feet, her social media influencer Grace vanishing instantly. "This is insane!" Chloe shrieked, pointing an accusing finger toward the ceiling. "Your mother was a spiteful old woman. She did this just to punish us because we didn't bow down to her dusty little machine shop." She turned her venom directly toward Marcus, who sat motionlessly in the corner with his hands folded calmly in his lap. "And you," Chloe hissed. "You played the long game, didn't you? You parasitized an old sick woman until she handed over $1 million that rightfully belongs to her own flesh and blood. You're nothing but a gold digger in a work shirt." Marcus didn't yell back. He didn't even flinch. He just looked up, his eyes steady and tired, and quietly said, "I never asked for anything. I simply stayed." Watching this unfold, my heart didn't break for the money. It broke for the delusion. Julian's face was twisted in a mask of pure agony and humiliation. But as I watched him hyperventilate over the lost fortune, I knew the truth. Their explosive rage wasn't about love, and it wasn't about grief. It was about the crushing public humiliation of losing $1 million and the sheer terror of what their followers online would think when they realized they weren't the wealthy heirs they pretended to be. It forces a heavy question, doesn't it, my friends? As you listen to this, tell me in the comments below. When the final ledger of a person's life is opened, does true family get measured by shared blood and the noise of public promises? Or is it measured by the quiet, heavy cost of simply showing up? The flight from Portland back to Seattle was entirely silent. Maybe death gave me the strange privilege of watching the people I left behind, because I was right there hovering over cabin row 12 as my son Julian stared blankly out the airplane window. For a fleeting second, his gaze caught the sharp reflection of his own tired eyes in the glass, and I couldn't help remembering the days when he was 6, sitting happily on my old wooden workbench with grease smudged on his nose. Beside him, his wife Chloe didn't look at him once. Her thumb swiped furiously across her smartphone screen, refreshing page after page, her face tightening into an increasingly ugly scowl. By the time their Tesla pulled into the driveway of their upscale glass and steel home in Seattle, the digital storm had already swallowed them whole. Julian rushed inside, threw his designer briefcase onto the kitchen island, and immediately logged onto his laptop. Fueled by humiliation and rage, he wanted to fight back. He wanted to rewrite the narrative. Within an hour, he and Chloe crafted a carefully worded statement on social media, filled with bitter hints about a manipulative, toxic parent and an unjust backroom will designed to cheat a biological son out of his birthright. They were fishing for sympathy, expecting their digital echo chamber to rally behind them, validate their anger, and burn my memory in effigy. They completely underestimated how tired the internet is of selfish people. Almost instantly, the backlash hit them like a freight train. Within hours of their post going live, local news outlets in Oregon cross-referenced the viral photograph of the empty velvet chair with court documents from the reading of the will. The internet detectives went to work, and they weren't forgiving. Instead of getting sympathy, Julian and Chloe's post was ratioed into oblivion. Thousands of comments tore their narrative to shreds. You skipped your mother's Lifetime Achievement Award to sit on a beach in Maui, and now you're crying because she didn't leave her hard-earned money to an ingrate? One top comment read, with over 40,000 likes. Another viral reply added, "A mother doesn't punish a son by leaving her shop to someone who actually cared. She simply leaves her legacy to the person who showed up when you walked away." Strangers dug up old, glowing posts of Chloe bragging about her luxury lifestyle, contrasting them sharply with the unvarnished reality of an aging mother sitting alone under the state convention lights. People online didn't just disagree with them, they exposed them. Commenters branded Chloe an entitled parasite and labeled Julian a spineless corporate drone who traded his own flesh and blood for social media clout. Watching this unfold from the quiet corners of my new perspective, I saw the exact moment the thin veneer of Julian and Chloe's perfect marriage began to crack. It didn't start with a dramatic shouting match. It started with a cold, terrifying silence across the marble kitchen island. Chloe slammed her phone down onto the counter, the screen flashing bright against the dark granite. She turned to Julian, her eyes completely devoid of any warmth or affection. $1 million, Julian," Chloe snapped, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Your mother had $1 million tied up in that property and trust, and you let a hired hand walk away with every single cent of it. What kind of a man are you? You couldn't even secure your own family's inheritance because you were too busy letting your pride get in the way during negotiations. Julian blinked, stepping back as if he had been physically struck. Me? My pride? Chloe, you were the one who insisted we go to Maui instead of attending the ceremony. You said a small town mechanical award wasn't worth our time. Chloe let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut straight to the bone. Oh, please, don't try to pin this on me now that we lost. I expected you to handle your mother. I expected you to be this smart corporate executive who knew how to secure our future. Instead, you're just a weak failure who got outsmarted by a mechanic in a flannel shirt. Frankly, it's pathetic. She turned on her heel, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and walked upstairs, slamming the master bedroom door shut behind her. Julian stood alone in the cavernous, silent kitchen. He looked down at his phone, watching the notifications pile up. Not with supportive messages, but with a relentless wave of public scorn and mockery. For the first time in 10 years of marriage, Julian looked around his expensive, sterile house and felt a profound, freezing emptiness. He realized that the woman he had chosen over his own mother, the woman he had put above every family holiday, every phone call, and every Sunday dinner, didn't love him for who he was. She loved what he represented, what he could buy, and how well he fit into her curated online aesthetic. And the moment the money vanished, the illusion vanished with it. He sat down heavily on a bar stool, burying his face in his hands as the realization finally hit him. He had traded a mother's unconditional, lifelong love for a gilded cage, and now he was completely, utterly alone inside it. 2 days after the storm of social media backlash and his bitter fight with Chloe, Julian did something he hadn't done in 6 years. He got behind the wheel of his car alone, left the sterile glass towers of Seattle behind, and drove south toward the quiet Oregon town where I spent my entire life. As I watched from the passenger seat of his memories, his hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were stark white. He wasn't driving back out of grief or a sudden wave of filial love. He was wrapped in a heavy, defensive armor of righteous anger. In his mind, he was still the victim, a wronged son whose rightful inheritance had been stolen by a manipulative outsider. The 2-hour drive blurred past until he pulled off the highway and parked right in front of my old machine shop. The sliding metal doors were half open. The familiar smell of burnt engine oil, hot iron, and pine shavings drifted out into the crisp morning air. Inside, the rhythmic, steady hum of a lathe told him someone was working. Julian stepped out of his car, slammed the door shut, and marched straight through the entrance. Marcus was standing by the workbench, wiping grease from his hands with a shop rag. He didn't look startled. He just turned, laid the rag down on the bench, and waited with a calm, tired patience that only came from years of weathering storms. Julian didn't waste a single breath on greetings. "Cut the act, Marcus," Julian snapped, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. He stepped right up to the workbench, his eyes darting angrily around the cluttered shop. $1 million. Let's not pretend this was an honest arrangement. My mother was sick. Her mind was tired in her final months, and you took advantage of that vulnerability. How did you manipulate her into signing over the entire trust and property? Marcus didn't yell back. He didn't puff out his chest or raise his voice to match Julian's hostility. He simply stood there, looking straight into Julian's bloodshot eyes with a heavy, sorrowful steadiness. Slowly, Marcus reached into the pocket of his faded flannel shirt. He pulled out a heavy brass key on a worn leather ring and my personal workshop logbook with grease stains on the cover. Marcus laid them both carefully on the center of the workbench, right between them. "She wasn't manipulated, Julian," Marcus said, his voice quiet, steady, and completely devoid of anger. "Up until her very last breath, your mother had a sharper mind than anyone in this county." Julian stared down at the key and the notebook, his jaw tightening. "Spare me the loyalty speech. $1 million doesn't just get handed to a stranger unless there was coercion involved." Marcus shook his head slowly. He picked up the leather notebook and slid it across the metal table toward Julian. "She didn't give me the shop and that trust because I flattered her," Marcus said softly. "She gave it to me because for 8 years, when the winter cold froze the pipes, I was here. When the main transmission lathe broke down at midnight, I stayed to fix it. When she couldn't breathe enough to lift a wrench, I handed it to her. She didn't strip anything away from you, Julian. She simply handed her life's work to someone who actually knew what this place needed just to keep breathing." Julian's hand hovered inches above the leather notebook. For a second, he looked like he wanted to shove it off the table, to scream denial, to reject every single word. Instead, his fingers twitched, brushed against the worn cover, and stopped. Watching from the quiet corners of the shop, I think the exact moment his armor began to fracture started right there. He looked around the sprawling, dusty workshop. At the heavy drill presses I bolted into the concrete floor back in 1980, at the shelf of old radios I used to repair on Sundays, at the calendar on the wall still flipped to the month of my passing. And I imagine a devastating, suffocating realization hit him like a physical blow. He looked at the shop, and I couldn't even remember where Mom kept the socket set or what any of the levers did. He didn't know which machines rattled when they started up, or why the west corner window always leaked when it rained. In that single quiet moment, standing across from a young man in a flannel shirt, Julian had to face the most painful truth of his life. It wasn't that he had been cheated out of $1 million. It was that he had spent 10 years running so fast toward a digital, polished life in Seattle that he had completely erased himself from his mother's world. He didn't lose an inheritance. He had lost his mother a decade before her heart ever stopped beating, because he never bothered to learn who she really was. Julian's hand slowly pulled back, trembling slightly, as the heavy silence of the shop settled around them like lead. Instead of turning around and driving back to Seattle that afternoon, Julian stayed. He didn't go back to the hotel. He unlocked the front door of my old craftsman house, the small, unpretentious home where he had taken his first steps, and walked inside. It smelled of old cedar, worn wool, and the faint, permanent trace of coffee and machine grease that always clung to my clothes. For the next 3 days, Julian didn't touch his phone. He didn't check his emails, and he didn't call Chloe. Instead, he began the heavy, quiet work of sorting through my things. On the third afternoon, carrying a stack of old cardboard boxes, he climbed the narrow wooden stairs up to the attic. The attic was a dusty, forgotten space under the eaves, heavy with the smell of old paper and dried lavender. As he cleared away a stack of rusted spare parts in the corner, his hand brushed against an old metal lockbox tucked beneath a workbench. The key was sitting right on top of it. Julian clicked the latch open and pulled out what was inside. It wasn't money, stock portfolios, or deeds. It was a collection of thick, lined notebooks and a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied together with twine, letters addressed to him, stamped and ready, but never mailed. With trembling fingers, Julian opened the top notebook, my personal journal spanning over 20 years. He sat down directly on the dusty wooden floor, the afternoon sunlight slicing through the small attic window, and began to read. Page after page, my handwriting stared back at him. I hadn't written words of anger or bitterness. I had written quiet chronicles of absence. He turned a page and saw an entry from a past birthday. Julian called today just for 40 seconds. Said he had an investor dinner in Seattle and couldn't make the drive down for the pie I baked. I left a slice in the fridge anyway. Marcus helped me eat it. Julian's breath hitched. He set the journal down with a shaky hand and reached into the metal box to pull out the bundle of unmailed letters. He slipped out a letter, dated, from a Christmas years ago, unfolding the fragile paper. My dearest Julian, another holiday table set for 3, but you were too busy chasing a promotion in the city. I hope warmth finds you over there because it's terribly cold here without your voice. At the very bottom of the box, underneath the letters, sat a small, faded greeting card. It was in my late husband's handwriting. David, Julian's father. David had written it to me during a time when he and Julian were growing distant over the workshop business. Julian opened the card and read his father's final words of advice. Evelyn, don't be too hard on the boy. Men in our family have a stubborn disease. We bury our love underneath our work, thinking people will just guess it's there, but time doesn't wait for us to finish our projects. Don't let busyness rob us of the people who matter most. That was the moment the dam broke. Julian didn't just shed a tear. He crumpled forward, pressing his face into the rough wool of his jacket, and sobbed. It wasn't the bitter, angry cry of a man who had lost $1 million. It was the gut-wrenching, silent wail of a grown man realizing he had completely wasted his life. Sitting alone in that dusty attic, surrounded by the physical proof of a mother's patient, unrequited love, Julian felt the cold, hollow truth settle deep into his chest. He realized he hadn't just lost an inheritance. He had traded his soul for corporate metrics and social media validation. He had allowed himself to be reshaped by a cold, manipulative marriage that prized appearances over affection, turning him into a stranger, the only person who had ever truly loved him unconditionally. The ambition that he thought made him successful suddenly felt like ash in his mouth. For 10 years, he had been running a race toward a finish line that didn't exist, while his mother sat downstairs, waiting for a phone call that lasted longer than a minute. As I watched from the quiet shadows of the room, my ghost didn't feel triumph. I only felt a profound, aching sorrow for my boy, because I knew that true regret is a heavy burden, and the hardest person to forgive is always the one looking back at you in the mirror. You're absolute nothing! Chloe didn't try to save the marriage. She didn't shed a single tear of regret. Within 2 hours, Chloe had packed her designer luggage, called an Uber, and walked out of his life forever, leaving behind an empty, silent house and a handful of digital memories that meant nothing. Julian didn't chase after her. He didn't look back at the sterile life he had built. He packed a single duffel bag of simple clothes, handed the keys to the Seattle real estate agent, and drove back down south to Oregon. He didn't announce his return on social media. There were no dramatic posts, no hashtags, and no pleas for public sympathy. He walked straight through the heavy sliding doors of my old machine shop, where Marcus was busy welding a lawnmower deck. Marcus looked up through his protective mask, lifting it slowly to survey Julian's appearance. Julian wasn't wearing an expensive designer suit anymore. He wore a heavy, faded, cotton work shirt, rugged jeans, and boots covered in dried mud. "I'm not here to take over, Marcus," Julian said quietly, his voice steady. "And I'm not here for the trust." But if you'll let me, I want to learn how to turn a wrench." Marcus didn't smile, but a quiet, understanding look passed through his eyes. He simply nodded once, tossed Julian a spare pair of work gloves, and pointed to a greasy, disassembled transmission on the back table. That was how Julian's real redemption began. Not with a miraculous epiphany, but with blisters, sore muscles, and the quiet humiliation of starting from absolute zero. The first week was brutal. Julian's soft corporate hands were torn and bleeding by the second day. On his fourth day, during a crucial assembly, Julian's hands slipped. A heavy steel gear slammed down incorrectly, snapping a small alignment pin and jamming the entire casing. He froze, biting his lip, expecting the kind of sharp corporate reprimand he was used to enduring. Marcus didn't yell. He walked over, looked at the ruined part, and simply laid a heavy, calloused hand on Julian's shoulder. "Don't rush the metal, kid," Marcus said softly, handing him a replacement pin. "Iron only bends to patience. Try it again." In that quiet moment, standing side by side over the workbench, something shifted. Marcus wasn't just teaching him mechanics. He was teaching him how to breathe. Week by week, the transformation happened in the silence of the workshop. Julian stopped checking his phone entirely. He missed the online chatter, the influencer drama, and the relentless noise of Seattle. As he worked side by side with Marcus, sweeping the concrete floors at sunset, hauling heavy iron parts, and drinking black coffee from a chipped mug, the hard, defensive shell around his heart began to wear away. He learned the names of the local farmers and neighbors who brought their broken equipment to the shop. People my hands had helped for 40 years. When they looked at Julian now, they didn't see an arrogant corporate director. They saw a man trying to earn his place back among honest people, one gear at a time. Watching from the quiet sidelines of memory, I felt a deep, enduring peace settle over my spirit. Redemption isn't something you can buy, and it isn't something you can post online for applause. It is earned in the dark, quiet hours, paid for with calloused hands, aching bones, and the humbling sweat of honest labor. Julian was finally paying his dues, not to me, but to himself. Months turned into seasons, and the rhythm of the old machine shop settled into a steady, peaceful pulse that felt like a heartbeat after a long illness. If you walked past the corrugated metal doors during those quiet Oregon mornings, you wouldn't have noticed any dramatic changes. The paint on the wooden window frames was still peeling from decades of winter rain. The concrete floorboards still bore stubborn motor oil stains, and the sharp scent of hot iron and pine shavings remained thick in the air. But something fundamental, something sacred, had shifted inside these walls, centered entirely around the man now holding the legal title, Marcus. Marcus didn't buy a luxury car, didn't move into a glass penthouse in Portland, and didn't disconnect himself from the neighbors. The very first week the legal transfer went through court, Marcus walked straight into the local community bank on Main Street. He took the entire cash reserve held in the business trust and established a formal, perpetual endowment, the Evelyn Vance Technical Scholarship, legally locked away to fund full tuition and tools for working-class kids in our county who dreamed of trade crafts. That money wasn't a lottery win to be flaunted. It was a seed planted right back into the soil where it belonged. Life at the shop didn't skip a beat, though it wasn't without its brutal days of friction. About 3 months in, the physical toll nearly broke Julian. On a freezing Tuesday morning, after spending 4 straight hours wrestling a rusted axle with blistered, bleeding hands, Julian threw his wrench down against the concrete with a loud metallic clatter that echoed off the metal walls. "I can't do this, Marcus," Julian snapped, panting heavily, his face smudged with soot and frustration. I'm not built for this dirt. Every bone in my body aches, and I feel like I'm just playing dress up in someone else's life. Maybe I should just pack my bags and go back to Seattle." Marcus didn't yell, and he didn't mock him. He slowly set down his sanding block, walked over, and handed Julian a warm cup of coffee. "Nobody said you had to be a master mechanic overnight, kid," Marcus said quietly. "Your mother spent 40 years building this place one gear at a time. You spent 10 years running away from it. You can't undo a decade of running in 3 weeks. But if you walk out those doors today, you're not quitting the shop. You're quitting on yourself." Julian stood frozen, staring down at the steaming mug. The anger slowly drained out of him, replaced by a heavy, humbling shame. He picked up his wrench, wiped his hands on his jeans, and went back to work without another word. Every single morning, long before the sun crested over the eastern hills, Marcus arrived at 5:30. The first thing he did was pull out my old aluminum percolator, brewing a fresh pot of dark roast coffee with chicory. He poured a cup, walked over to my old wooden desk by the window, and set it down right where it had always sat, neatly, next to my reading glasses and a spare crescent wrench. It wasn't for show. It was out of deep, abiding respect. Watching Marcus work day after day, side by side with Julian now, brought a profound sense of closure to my restless spirit. People talk about karma as if it's a sudden, violent, cosmic lightning bolt meant to strike down the greedy. But standing here in the shadows, watching Marcus sweep the iron shavings while Julian wiped down a drill press, I realized real karma is much quieter than that. Karma isn't lightning. It's gravity. It is the slow, inevitable weight of how you treat people when nobody's watching. Chloe chased shadows and social status, ending up completely alone in a sterile house. Julian spent a decade running away from his roots, only to find out that a gilded cage is still a cage until you break it open yourself with your own bare hands. And Marcus? Marcus stayed when the pay was low. And when he was handed a fortune, he used it to lift others up instead of elevating himself above the community. The world calls that good luck, my friends. But down here in the grease and the iron, we call it true character. As the morning whistle blew across the valley, signaling the start of another honest day of work, I took one last look around the shop. The machines were humming. The coffee was steaming softly on my old desk, and for the first time in a very long time, the House of Vance was finally at peace. 1 full year had passed since the legal transfer of the estate, and the crisp autumn air of Oregon carried a completely different kind of energy this time around. An energy of healing, restoration, and quiet truth. The annual Pacific Northwest Community Engineering Exhibition was held at the very same downtown convention center where, exactly a year prior, I had sat alone under the blinding spotlights, waiting for a son who never showed up. But this year, the atmosphere inside the massive exhibition hall was entirely transformed. Giant banners hung from the exposed rafters, celebrating local ingenuity, beautifully restored machinery, and the enduring spirit of regional craftsmanship. And right there, shining proudly at the center of the grand hall, was the exhibition's highest and most prestigious honor, the Pioneer Innovation Award, presented jointly to the Vance Workshop, now co-managed side by side by Marcus and my son, Julian. When the announcer called out our family name over the loudspeaker, the crowd erupted into a warm, roaring wave of applause that shook the metal fixtures. Julian sat proudly in the front row. He wasn't wearing a $6,000 designer suit, and his phone wasn't buzzing in his hand with superficial social media notifications. He wore a simple, clean work shirt, his hands slightly calloused around the edges, and a streak of motor oil still faint beneath his fingernails. He wiped a drop of sweat from his forehead, let out a slow, steady breath, and looked up toward the stage where Marcus was stepping up to the microphone. Yet, as my spirit drifted across the front row, something else caught my attention, something that made my chest ache with a quiet, lingering warmth. Right beside Julian, at the very edge of the reserved seating row, sat an empty velvet chair. It wasn't left empty out of bitterness, nor to demand an apology from the crowd. Resting gently on the plush velvet cushion was a simple, elegant bouquet of freshly cut wild lavender and a worn crescent wrench. A quiet tribute, a place held permanently at the table for me. Julian looked over at that empty chair. He reached out, lightly brushed the cold metal of the wrench with his fingertips, and whispered softly into the quiet space between us. "I finally came home, Mom." He didn't look sad. He didn't look consumed by the crushing, toxic weight of regret. Instead, he gave a slow, gentle nod, a silent acknowledgement that finally bridged the long years of distance and misunderstanding between us. In that profound, silent moment, Julian understood the deepest truth of his entire journey. I was never really gone. I wasn't trapped forever in a cold grave, and I wasn't locked away in a dry legal document. I was living right inside the rhythmic, heavy hum of the lathe downstairs. I was breathing in the familiar scent of pine shavings and hot iron, residing in the calloused hands of a son who finally learned how to show up when it mattered, and in the quiet, steady dedication of a young man who knew how to keep the fires burning. A mother's true love hadn't vanished with my last ragged breath. It had simply taken deep root in the soil of genuine redemption. As the applause swelled around the grand hall and the stage lights glowed golden against the polished metal trophies, a profound, unshakable peace settled over my soul. The House of Vance was whole again, anchored not by the noise of public promises or the empty weight of $1 million inheritance, but by the quiet, heavy, beautiful cost of simply being present in each other's lives. And as the lights slowly dimmed over the valley, my ghost finally let go, resting easy in the knowledge that some bonds never truly break. They just wait patiently for us to find our way back home. And that, my friends, is the story of the House of Vance. It's a reminder that no matter how far we run, how busy our lives get, or how many digital milestones we chase, nothing can ever replace the simple, sacred weight of being present for the people who love us unconditionally. True wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, corporate titles, or viral views. Is measured in calloused hands, shared moments, and the unyielding warmth of family. If this story touched your heart today, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel and help us bring more meaningful stories to life. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, take care of yourselves, hold your loved ones close, and we'll see you in the next video.